So we saw the example of what happens whenever a price is set too low. And we said that whenever the price is set too low, we see that companies realize that they can't keep their price there because so many people want to buy it. And so they raise their price up because, a ton of people want to buy it and moves us close to our equilibrium. But what happens if our price is set too high? So let's look at an example of what if we, as we raise our price, businesses raise their price, and they raise it up to a price of $2.50. Well, what do we see going on there at $2.50? Well, if we start at $2.50 and draw lines on over, we notice that we run into our demand curve, that blue line first, and we run into our demand curve at 30 million gallons of gas. And then we run into our supply curve at 50 million gallons of gas. Well, what's going on here? Well, what we see is that the amount that's being supplied is bigger, 50 million, it's bigger than the amount that's being demanded, 30 million. And what do we call this? Well, we call this a surplus. A surplus is any time that we see more being supplied or being made available than is being demanded, right? So price is above the equilibrium price. Or another way you can say it is that the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So that gap that sits there between our demand curve and our supply curve at a price of $2.50, that's a surplus. And so as we look here, we say, well, what exactly is the size of that surplus? Well, we see that 50 million is being made available, but people only want to buy 30 million. Therefore, 20 million gallons of gas are left over. Now again, how do businesses respond to this? Well, typically businesses, whenever they make too much of something and they realize that, they say, hey, we got to get rid of this somehow. And so how do we get rid of it? People aren't buying it at this high of a price. Well, we lower the price. That's exactly what happens whenever anything in a store is put on sale. They realize, hey, at the price we were selling it at, we couldn't sell everything. We have a surplus of this product. And so in order to get rid of it, we have to lower our price. We have to put it on sale. And so typically we actually see companies are more willing to set their price too high at the beginning because they always know they can lower it later. They would rather do that than set it too low and then have to raise it later. Now, surpluses, again, are any time we see the quantity supplied greater than the quantity demanded. And that happens at any price that's above our equilibrium price. You guys can again see that on the schedule at a price of $3 or at a price of $2.75. Whenever the price gets really high, less people want to buy it, but more producers are willing to make it. And so we just have a whole lot of it sitting around. But eventually, again, market forces kick in and producers will lower their price and we'll get it down to that equilibrium. We'll naturally move there in response to either surpluses or shortages whenever the price is too low. So we'll always naturally move toward our equilibrium. Now, where do we see this play out in instances whenever the government steps in and prevents us from lowering our price to the equilibrium? Well, one great example of this is actually in the supply and demand for labor. Now, one thing I want us to keep in mind is I make note of this is that this is happening in the resource market. So remember, in the resource market, we see the factors of production are being bought and sold. And so therefore, the supplier of whatever product in the labor market, so the supplier of labor is actually you and me, right? The people, because we own the labor, so we're the suppliers, and the demanders are our employers. And sometimes the government actually sets in and they set a restriction where they say, hey, you're not allowed to go below this price. So it's not a maximum like we saw before, it's a minimum. And this minimum is known as a price floor. Just like the floor in whatever room you're in is the minimum of that room, a price floor is a minimum price set within a market. It prevents us from lowering our price to the equilibrium. So where do we see this play in? Well, like we said, the labor market. There is some equilibrium price for labor, some equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So I have PE for the equilibrium price, and I have QE for the quantity at the equilibrium. But what we end up seeing is we don't get to hit that equilibrium because the government has stepped in and they've drawn a line and they say, all right, you are not allowed to sell labor for less than this price, $7.25. Well, what do we call that? Well, we call it minimum wage. Right? They say there is a specific price that you are not allowed to sell your labor for less than, right? It's a minimum. You can't go below that. But what we end up seeing happens is because that is set higher than our equilibrium, we see that now more people are willing to supply their labor at $7.25 than whatever that lower equilibrium was. But at the same time, we see that the demand for labor whenever it's higher has also decreased because now producers they would have to pay their workers more than a cheaper equilibrium price. And so we see this gap open up between the amount of labor being made available by you and me and the amount of labor that producers want to purchase, the demand for that labor. And so this gap opens up. Now, an effective price floor, again, is set above our equilibrium price, because if it was set below, it wouldn't be effective. Like, what if the government stepped in and say, hey, minimum wage is 50 cents? Okay, is that going to be effective? No, because there's probably nobody willing to supply their labor for 50 cents. Or if there is, there are very few people. It's not effective. We would hit our equilibrium well before that. And so they have to set that floor above the equilibrium price so that it keeps us from going down to our equilibrium. So again, that's backwards from what we think. We would think a ceiling would be above and a floor would be below, but they are flip-flopped. A floor, in order to be effective, has to be above, and a ceiling, in order to be effective, has to be below. Now, what do we call this surplus in this case? There's actually a specific name for this surplus in the labor market. Whenever we have more labor than what people need, we call it unemployment, right? Unemployment is the idea that we have more people willing to work than the work that's being demanded from employers. And so that's what we see is that, at a minimum wage labor, there is unemployment that opens up because there is a surplus of labor at that price.